clinical case studies are completely absent. You would have expected, if so many clinicians are treating neurological diseases, at least we can flood the research journals of the world with good case studies. Today, case studies are being encouraged. I want to tell you that there's a new guideline called CARE guideline. CARE means case reports. This is a CARE statement. Till now we had guidelines for clinical trials like consort statement, for observational studies, STROBE, for meta-analysis we have PRISMA. Now there is a guideline for case report. So case reports are being taken very seriously. And most Ayurvedic physicians, it's not difficult for us to start reporting because case reports become interesting when the numbers increase. If you start reporting 1 or 2 cases occasionally, what comes, that doesn't produce the critical mass. But what I calculated was if we just take 5 Ayurvedic clinicians who are good treating successfully neurological diseases, we can get that volume to make the thrust. If those 5 centers do good clinical case documentation, and if you publish it, suddenly people can get interested. Because I think in Ayurvedic research, 2 things are there. One question is, does Ayurveda work? The other question is, how does it work? And please, what is the logical way of going? Which question should we ask first? Do we ask how Ayurveda works or does Ayurveda work? So the first question is, does Ayurveda work? So I think this is what research should address. We must bring out research publications which answer this first question. Yes, it works. Yes, it works. Then, it's immaterial whether we find the answer. That's an bonus that if we also know how it works, it's well and good. Because recently we had a conference on diabetes and Ayurveda, and a professor from Latvia came. And he made a very surprising statement for many of us. He said, we don't know really how metformin works, but we still use it because it works. So even in modern medicine, it's empirical most of the time. Whether something works is more important than how it works. And in Ayurveda, we have gone the other way. We have always tried to address the issue of how it works. We are jumping to mechanisms before really understanding what. I would say that we need a third question also. Does Ayurveda work? Then what in Ayurveda works? So test that what. Because so Ayurveda works, yes. So then you say mucuna pruriens works. That is wrong. It's not mucuna pruriens that works, but it's an entire formulation and an entire treatment algorithm that works. So unless you ask what works, and then does it work, and then how does it work? This is the sequence. Then research will completely change, and then we can impact the global community. And I think we start thinking in this direction. Next slide, please. So is another one. Ayurvedic constitution identifies risk factor of developing Parkinson's disease. It's a very interesting paper done by a neurologist from USA. Now this is what I would say, the kind of research that should be done, because it brings the Ayurvedic concept. This is a strength in Ayurveda, that you can predict Parkinson's when it's not possible. You can identify the risk and maybe treat patients before the disease really advances. This is something unique that Ayurveda can contribute. So you can see, these are like what you can say the silver linings in the cloud. Here and there you find people are beginning, but it's not gathering momentum. And at this pace, these are so isolated kind of studies that they will never be able to create an impact. So I believe that we have to completely change the whole course of Ayurvedic research, and neurology is just one area where we have to actually work. So next slide. So this is my conclusion, that research in neurology itself is in a preliminary stage, research in Ayurveda itself is in a preliminary stage. So it's too early to really talk about trends. I mean, we are not really. What we need to discuss in such a seminar is, what is the research strategy we need to adopt for doing research on neurodegenerative diseases? Which are the priority areas? Because we are in that stage. When you say trends in neurological research, you anticipate that a lot of work has already happened, which has not happened. So it's not a topic that will bring any substance. Next slide, please. So what kind of research should happen on Ayurveda? So should we conduct clinical trials or animal studies or preclinical studies? What is the way forward? We are still not addressed these fundamental issues, and we are still talking about research. Next slide. So I feel that This is variously called as reverse pharmacology or practice-based approach to evaluation, because Ayurveda is a living tradition. It's not something new. People are already practicing. We just need to know who are the successful. Today we have so-called good Ayurveda and so-called bad Ayurveda. The problem is the bad Ayurveda is becoming more widespread and the good Ayurveda is getting marginalized. So we have to quickly identify where the clinical strengths of Ayurveda lies. And we have to identify the best practices. That's the first step. So we know these diseases, these clinicians, these outcomes are actually happening. So we need this clinical documentation, movement in Ayurveda. In Western medicine, they're talking about this as practice-based research. The next step. And once we identify the best practices, we have to optimize them because there are variations from one physician to the other. I have spent time with so many clinicians. For the same disease, this process went through in modern medicine also. Before they came with standard guidelines, they actually worked in the field. They had so much of consensus conferences. You won't find such meetings at all in Ayurveda. We need consensus conferences. Today we have consensus conferences between people who do nothing in the field. So they cannot come and have only when there is something to really debate, you can have a consensus conference. So you must be very careful. You must do a lot of field work and bring those practitioners who can really, bring out what we call as optimized practices. And only when we know what are the optimized practices, we should do any evaluation of that. So we have to understand Ayurveda and then evaluate it. Today we are evaluating Ayurveda and misunderstanding it. See, it's a self-destructive process. You understand and evaluate, but instead of that, you are evaluating and misunderstanding. So that is the problem. Next. So then the last step would be exploring the biological mechanisms. So we talk with a lot of scientists and they say, yes, but without knowing the scientific basis, it's very difficult for your system to get access. We said it's fine, nobody is against doing that. But it's all a question of strategy. It's all a question of, sequencing the steps properly. For anything, you need a preparation. There has to be the phases. So we only say that there's nothing wrong in exploring biological mechanisms, but we must do it at the appropriate, context. There are many things before that we need to do, which is completely neglected. And if you jump directly into biological mechanisms, we will never really understand. Next slide. And I think there are more fundamental clinical things that we need to do. We jump into evaluating what can Ayurveda do in multiple sclerosis. But have you asked this fundamental question, what is multiple sclerosis in Ayurveda? Is multiple sclerosis described in Ayurvedic texts? No. So there's a lot of work that clinicians have to do. Again, we need, the Center for Disease Control, or, we need a disease watch, group in Ayurveda, who study new diseases, evaluate, and present it from an Ayurvedic perspective. In multiple sclerosis, you can see there's tremendous heat in the body of the patient. You can see a lot of Vata Pitta signs. And it's very easy for an Ayurvedic physician to evaluate and understand that this is a progressive Vata Pitta type of disorder that affects the Madhyama Roga Marga. At least this understanding gives us a clue on how we must actually handle it. So we are not doing this. And Charaka really talks about, our text clearly said everything is not described here. There is Ukta Vyadhi, described diseases, Anukta Vyadhi, which have not been listed. So what the texts have told, when you get a new disease, you have to analyze it and give it an Ayurvedic interpretation and understanding so that we can develop treatment protocols. So again, we are jumping. We are putting the cart before the horse. I think this is typical of all Ayurvedic activities. Like we put the cart before the horse. Is that right, what I said? Yeah. And then we ask the horse to move. So, next slide, please. So what I want to suggest is, while we try to do those researches, there's a lot of interesting developments that's happening in modern neurological research also, which could just be back translated. And then it gives you new insights on Ayurveda. So I hope I'm clear. What I'm suggesting is we have to completely change the way we do research if we want to make an impact. We have to focus from the lab to the clinics. And from the clinics, we have to build up things from best practices to optimized practices, and then evaluate, test, confirm through rigorous studies it really works, and then go to the biological mechanisms. And in this process, we have to identify new diseases from an Ayurvedic perspective. Otherwise, we cannot develop these protocols. While we do this, there's a lot of new research which is really rediscovering many things that were discussed in Ayurveda. So this I find more interesting. Research trends, I would say research trends in modern neurological research that are echoing or rediscovering many insights in Ayurveda. So I want to present before you 4 such points today. One is the concept of neuroplasticity. It's something which modern neurologists have ignored. It's something which started in the 1960s, but it's only recent times that in the neurological community it is being taken seriously. But you can see how close it is to the Ayurvedic understanding of the nervous system. Next is the connection between brain and cholesterol and ghee. There's a lot of new findings, new guidelines on dietary cholesterol, which has completely changed the way things were done. Then is a connection between fever and neurological diseases. Vata Vyadhi is the end of all our chikitsa sthanas, and the beginning is Jwara. In Ayurveda, Jwara can lead directly to Vata Vyadhi. If it doesn't happen, then all other diseases will come. The end stage is Vata Vyadhi. For us, Vata Vyadhi is finally an outcome of many prior events. And we'll explore that connection a bit. And the fourth is the idea of multiple brains in the body. We are talking about one brain. And Ayurveda never focused on one thing in the body. As I was mentioning, we looked at this brain as only the tip of the iceberg. For us, the whole body was also like a brain. And we identified so many such neurological centers. And this is finding support through modern neurological research. So next slide. I'd like to first talk about neuroplasticity. When we were students, this is what actually, I got depressed several times. I think it's a surprise that I'm mentally okay. Because I'm sure Ayurvedic course, if you're a very serious person to study Ayurveda, you stand the chance of getting depressed several times in the course. First exposure to anatomy, you get depressed. When you get exposed to neurology, again you get depressed because you compare with Ayurveda, there is no brain at all. So it's a brainless Ayurveda that you see when you study the texts. But still we are treating neurological diseases. This was always an enigma. And when we were students, we thought it was so important. See, modern science is so specific that if something happens in the brain, whether it's upper motor neuron lesion or lower motor neuron lesion, whether it's happening in the amygdalas or whether it is happening in the optic chiasma or whether it is the visual cortex that is damaged or whether it's a frontal lobe, they're so specific which artery has actually been damaged. When you come to Ayurveda, it's all a nebulous thing. There's only one Vata. So we thought that how can, with such a vague understanding of the brain and the human body, how are Ayurvedic physicians treating? It was always a puzzle to me. Until in recent times I read about neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is a new concept which completely changes the traditional way of looking at the brain as a very rigid structure, which said that after a certain age the brain cannot change. But today the brain, it seems, can change till your old age. The brain is continuously reconstructing itself. It's rewiring itself. And there's a very eminent neurologist, Norman Doidge, neuropsychiatrist, I think, who was one of the leading persons to bring out a lot of case studies which completely baffle the modern neurologists, which completely, upset the modern theories of rigid brain and showed that neuroplasticity is a possibility. So what this says is that by your thought and by your action, you can rewire your brain. So we'll come to that again. Next slide, please. So I still remember I laughed when I was a student when I started reading Vata Vyadhi Nidanam. I found a Sahasranama of Vata there. So I was wondering how these people are going too much, our acharyas sometimes, that they are getting too religious, and when they are talking something very serious about Vata Vyadhi, suddenly they pray. Frankly, at that time I thought our people are praying too much. I mean, I was very young at that time. So even in a clinically serious thing, they should talk. So sarvartha anartha karane vishwasya asya karanam adushta dushta pavana sharirasya visheshada. So what is interesting, there is a eulogy, a praise of Vata. Sa Vishwakarma, Vishwatma, Vishwarupa, Prajapati, Srashta Dhata, Vibhur Vishnu, Samharta, Mrityu, Antakaha. Now if you look at this, this is suddenly an outpouring of emotion. Before describing Vata Vyadi, our acharyas are praying and eulogizing Vata. What is the purpose? It took a long time for me. I thought it was just a religious inclination of our acharyas that made them speak like this. But once you understand neuroplasticity, it becomes very evident that this was their way of expressing the phenomenon called neuroplasticity. Because these verses, especially, so Vishwakarma. Vishwakarma means actually the architect. And today neuroplasticity says that the brain is its own architect. The brain is restructuring itself again and again. So Vishwakarma, Vishwatma, Vishwarupa, Prajapati, Srashta, Dhata, but you have also negative traits attributed to it. Samharta, Mrityurantaka. So here we find neuroplasticity as a double-edged sword. Now let's look at the modern finding. So please go to the next slide. So here you find that this neurologist says, he talks about what is called as a plastic paradox. He says the plasticity of the brain presents itself as a paradox, that there is the good and there is the bad about plasticity. The good thing is that it renders our brains not only more resourceful, but also more vulnerable to outside influences. So neuroplasticity has the power to produce more flexible brain, but also more rigid behaviors. And you can see this is exactly what the acharyas explained when they said, Sa Vishwakarma, Vishwatma. Tremendous flexibility. With Vata, when you awaken Vata in your system, you are awakening an architect that can completely restructure your brain, your neurological system. On the other hand, he's also a Samharta, can make very rigid patterns in your nervous system. And this is today known as plastic paradox. I did not imagine that in those verses of Vagbhada, the Nidhanasthana of Vata Vyadhi, was hidden the concept of plastic paradox, which is now explained in a more technological manner. So you can see, I think that if there's one thing that is unique about Ayurvedic approach to neurological diseases, it's the concept of neuroplasticity. Maybe there is more, but definitely neuroplasticity is one thing, because in Ayurveda we have now if you see our treatments, we never bothered about which part of the brain is damaged. With neuroplasticity, it makes a lot of sense. Now, neurologists are saying, if one part cannot work, the brain can reorganize another part and bring back that function. So there are people who got their visual cortex damaged and they got back their vision. There are people whose specific areas in the brain have been damaged and neurologists wrote them off, but they were able to recover those functions. And this is neuroplasticity. And I believe that Ayurveda is a tool for facilitating this neuroplastic, regeneration in the body. So, Sushkanyabhihi kashtani, sneha svedobhapadanai, sukhamanamayitum shakyam, kimugatrani jivatam. So this plasticity, they are talking about so poetically and so simply, that just like we put oil and you steam a stick and it is plastic, it becomes plastic, you can change it. So the human body also can be made flexible and adaptable just through this process of snehana and swedana. So I think this is an area where we must explore. I mean, where modern research and Ayurveda seems to be converging. Next slide, please. So this is what I want to say, that in 1960s and 70s, so it takes a lot of time for this kind of research. When a new idea comes into neurology, 60s people could have embraced neuroplasticity. But see how many years? 40 years plus 15 years. It's 55 years, it has taken 5 decades for the modern neurological community to take neuroplasticity seriously. So if in Ayurveda also, we are going to face the same problem. We are going to come up with theories and ideas that may not be very easily accepted. But that is the challenge. But we can spearhead and bring new research. Next slide, please. So this is the book I would strongly encourage those who are interested in neurological research to please read this book, The Brain That Changes Itself. And here we have case studies, actually real case studies of people. So again, it's a case study approach. Actual practices which proved that neuroplasticity is a reality. And now they're beginning to understand the mechanism. There are different types of neuroplasticity. In my small note that was shared, I have discussed all that. But I think it's not necessary to go into those technicalities. You can always study and understand more about neuroplasticity. I just wanted to introduce that concept. The next slide, please. Now, the second point is about brain and cholesterol. This is very recent. The US government is poised to withdraw long-standing warnings about cholesterol. In the US, all these regulatory agencies were paranoid about cholesterol. Cholesterol? No, no, no. So 5 years it took the government to enforce this idea in the brains of the people that cholesterol is a red alert. And now they're completely reversing it. Please, next slide. The nation's top nutrition advisory panel has decided to drop its caution about eating cholesterol-laden food. A move that could undo almost 40 years of government warnings about its consumption. It's taken 40 years to convince people not to take cholesterol. And once they are convinced, now they are telling no. Now it will take another 40 years to bring them back. So this is how modern research sometimes happens. There's no balanced way of understanding. So the group's finding is that cholesterol in the diet need no longer be considered as a nutrient of concern. Stands in contrast to the committee's findings 5 years ago. So here, so the ultimate conclusion is that eating foods high in cholesterol may not significantly affect the level of cholesterol in the blood or increase the risk of heart disease. And Ayurveda, we know, we are very cholesterol-fond people. Grida, Sneha, Taila, Sneham, Snehasaroyam Purusha. We are nothing but cholesterol. That is the Ayurvedic approach. So ultimately we believed that Nahi Sneha Samidhasya Shamayanam Sugurvabi. Anything which stabilizes, strengthens and finally makes the body stable is Sneha, Shida Snigdha Guna. That was what Ayurveda discovered. And now you can find this care about cholesterol is creating a lot of health problems. Next slide, please. So Ayurveda, we say ghee. Tatra dhi smriti medhagni kangshinam shasyade ghridam. If you want to improve your brain and your higher mental faculties, then drink ghee. Yeah, I'll just finish. So modern nutritionists tend to look at this with suspicion. But see, ghee is 62% of saturated fat. Next slide. And cow's ghee is mentioned in diet and medicine. So, but in Ayurveda, we have clearly said that Grida, see Ayurveda, there was never a confusion. We said Grida is Visha and Amrita at the same time. Anyadhatu Vishopamam. Otherwise, Yathamritam. So we knew that depending on the metabolic condition of the body, it can be either good or bad. Next slide. So from the Ayurvedic point of view, we do not have to worry about the presence of cholesterol in ghee. The brain makes up just 2 to 3% of the total body. But 25% of the body cholesterol is found in the brain. So that is proof enough to show the connection between. So Ayurveda also says the brain is like Navanedam, it's like Gridam. So we found again that connection there. So there are studies which show how cholesterol is necessary for brain function. Next slide, please. We are running out of time, so I'll just go through. So, yeah, next slide. We just skip this. So now they have found there is a warning on the NIH website which comes from FDA. What they say is that statins, they have asked to add a new warning that if you take too much of statins, especially risk groups, then you can develop cognitive problems in old age. And another study showed that people who have higher levels of cholesterol in the blood, they have lesser cognitive problems in old age. Which means trying to save your heart, you are killing your brain. And cognitive problems are becoming so rampant in modern society. So Ayurveda says there is a way to save both your heart and your brain. And that is the process of nirama. Niramaya, as Ayurveda says. If your body is nirama, then the Grida will not only protect your brain, but also protect your heart. So we really got an handle of how to use ghee in a balanced way. An Ayurvedic physician would never go to these two extremes. 40 years to tell no ghee, then another 40 years to say yes ghee. Finally, we will say what Ayurveda says yes and no. We have always said yes and no. We knew where to say yes and we knew where to say no. Modern science still does not know that difference. They are still stuck between these two extremes. That is the insight of Ayurveda. And as Ayurvedic physicians, it's time we came forward with the strength of our conceptual knowledge and made the world more enlightened. We have no confusions in the use of many of these substances. Next. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. Only two more points. One is I want to tell you there is a connection between Jwara and neurological diseases. I got a patient of spinocerebellar ataxia. Genetic. After all the modern evaluation, I felt so depressed. I thought, send him away because it's genetic, nothing we can do. But then we thought we'll do an Ayurvedic analysis. And what he told was he got an attack of chikungunya and it didn't affect his joints, but after that his problem started. And actually I started treating him for Dhadugata Jwara in the Madhyama Roga Marga. And within a few weeks, his whole face completely changed. When he came back after 3 weeks, I couldn't recognize him. There was so much ojas in his face. So there is a connection. If you see, chikungunya is affecting the Madhyama Roga Marga. That is why the joints are affected. Sirohridaya Vastyadi Marmanya Asthanam cha Sandhaya. So if the Madhyama Roga Marga is vulnerable and if your brain is open, then the doshas are going and attacking the brain. This concept is there in Ayurveda. Many neurological degenerative diseases, when you treat as a Vata Pitta manifestation, with a Jwara in the Madhyama Roga Marga, it is responding very well, especially in the beginning. Now, there are studies which showed that remnants of infections were found in the brain of people affected by many of these neurological diseases. That you can see the impact of an infection in the brain. Those bacteria can later trace from the brain. So you can see what Ayurveda said, the gati of the doshas from the Shakha to the Madhyama Roga Marga is actually proven by this observation. And so you can see how our whole Chikitsa Sthana is Jwara to Vada Vyati. That is the story. The first immune response and the final breakdown. You are in a vegetative state. This spectrum is what we explained through Chikitsa Sthana. Next slide. Okay, so these are all the details. You can go through it. I think you got a clue. The next slide, please. So even in MS, it's very clear. And what they find is fever is sometimes the cause for progression. So the progressive type of MS, you find this connection more than the relapsing and remitting type. So the role of fever is now being explored. So the last point I want to talk about is the many brains. So can I take 2 more minutes to conclude? 2 minutes? Yeah. So when I was a student, I always had a doubt, where is the mind in Ayurveda? Hridayam Chedana Sthana. I was very worried about this for a long time. Some of my teachers said, you please don't worry about it. So many other things are there. Every day I will go and ask, where is the mind in the body? Is it really in the heart? Because it's only pumping. So after a long time, I found there's a difference between Chetana and Manas. Because in Bhela Samhita, Sirasthalvandaragatam Sarvendriya Paramana. But in Sharira Sthana, they have mentioned Hridayam Chedana Sthanam. And Charaka has distinguished that Manas is Achedanam. Achedanam Kriyavacha Manaha. Chedaida Aparaha. Chedana is self. The heart was considered as a seat of awareness, not as the seat of the mind. Because when I say I always, all of us, if we say I, our hand will automatically come here. We will not say I. It always comes here. So that is the place where we feel that's awareness. So they said Chetana Sthana. But the mind, when we are talking in our mind, our finger always points here. And that is the seat of the mind. So this was a problem. But today you can see that modern science is coming out with a new concept that there is a gut brain. Not only the brain, there is a gut brain. And I was surprised to see, can you please go to the next slide? There are 100 billion neurons in our brain, but 500 million nerve endings in our gut. And I'll summarize the findings, that the gut is controlling the brain rather than the brain controlling the gut. And we know in Ayurveda, Nabhi has always been considered as the seat of prana. Nabhistha prana pavanaha. Sprishtva hritkamalandaram kandhat bahirviniryadi. So the Nabhi is an important seat of prana. So there are so many prana centers. We call these as pranayadanas. And this is a much better way to talk about neurological systems than just the brain and spinal cord. Charaka's pranayadanas are much more holistic, comprehensive ways of listing the neurological centers. So I feel Dasha pranayadanas. Charaka is telling there are 10 brains in your system. Today they are talking about 3 brains at least. And you know what is important? Your happiness is in your gut feeling. When we say intuition. Serotonin is a hormone which makes you feel happy. It's called as a happiness hormone. 95% of serotonin is in your gut. And if your ama is handled, they have found that if your gut, especially in children, if the gut flora is stable, then their brains function more efficiently. So this Ayurvedic emphasis on treating the gut to correct the brain. Next slide, please. Yeah, please. This is all you can check up. Next, the heart brain. So finally, I found an answer after 25 years of inquiry that there is something in the heart also. The heart also has 40,000 neurons, considering the fact that it is only, and it's also neuroendocrine. Heart is also controlling and communicating with the brain. So it's not just a pumping machine. And the thing is that recently they found the heart is an endocrine organ also. It stimulates the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is called the cuddling hormone. Love hormone. So traditionally we all put heart sign here as love. And today we know the hugging, when you hug a person, oxytocin comes. So if you are in the heart, you have to hug. I think that's why Amma is hugging everybody. And there is so much of oxytocin getting released. And there is this connection. So they're talking about the heart brain. Next. Yeah, so this is again the details, please. So I'm coming to the end. Next. Yes. So what I want to say is, there's at least one more important brain in Ayurveda. Can you guess which other organ we can consider as a brain? Which is an interface between the mind, the physical body, and which is a sthana of vata. And all our treatments for all neurological diseases happen using that organ. What is that organ? Loud. No. It's one of the largest organs in the body. Sparshanebhyadigam vayu, sparshanam cha tvagashrayam. It's one of the most important sthanas of vata. The skin brain. For Ayurveda, the skin is also a brain. And that is how our marmas, our touch therapy, our abhyangas, it will completely get a new dimension once we understand the neurology behind abhyanga. I think this is a new area of research where we can make headway. So the last point I wanted to say, and then if you start exploring the pranayadanas and some of the other marmasthanas, we can find that the body is a network of brains, a network of neurological systems, what we called as vata. That organizing principle is vata. And this is what I feel is that neurology, the brain, all this is just the tip of the iceberg. And what we see in the brain, I want to repeat what I said in the morning, is only the footprints of that invisible, phenomenon that we call the mind and the buddhi and the higher abilities. And our rishis and our acharyas, they knew how to distinguish the shadow from the real thing. So the brain is only a shadow. And all those lines and curves are just reflections of a more higher functionality, which we understood as vata, as prana. And that, I think, is the key to discovering new remedies for neurological researches. And I think research is all about discovering keys that open the door to new worlds of discovery. And I hope that Ayurveda will inspire such a discovery in the future. And I hope as a community, we will do more creative research and bring these treasures of Ayurvedic insights, marry them with the modern concepts of Ayurveda, and create a new science that is truly transforming for the human being. Thank you very much. My humble prostrations to Amma.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your views. Your presentation conveyed the various shortcomings of research in our field at present. At the same time, you shared your ideas regarding the future. Sir, please. Thank you, sir.